Hey, everybody, and welcome to another My Angular Story. This week, we're talking to Ward Bell. Ward, do you want to say hello?
Hello.
Now, we've had you on a number of Adventures in Angular shows because you're one of our regular hosts. And usually I start out, we have a host or, a past guest from the show. And so it's like, hey, you were on this episode. So I'm curious, what's been your favorite episode on the show?
Well, call me solipsistic, but I like it when we have our panel shows and we all go at it with each other because the humor is high and the chance of offending is very low, and we always find ourselves in fascinating corners.
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny. We changed up editors at the beginning of the year, and our current editor, he's like, Adventures in Angular is insane.
That's the way we want to keep it.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, the cleverness of my response there, by the way, means that I cannot offend any of our guests.
Yeah, it's really funny though, because he's like, there's stuff in that. Should I take that out? I'm like, no, just leave it. They know what they're doing.
Oh, so you say.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io. Anyway, so this show is more of a coding journey. So we talk about how you got into programming and how you got to where you are, how you got into Angular, all of that wonderful stuff. So if you don't mind, we'll just jump in right at the beginning and talk about how you got into programming.
Okay, so I was hanging out with Charles Babbage and
way back then, yeah.
Ada Lovelace. We were just having coffee one day and said, he said, I got this analytics engine. You want to play? And then 100 years later, no. So how did I get it? So I actually got in the 60s, late 60s. And I was hanging out in a high school, and it was just one of, in those days, the computers were not on anybody's mind. They were as fantastical as something you would read in Scientific American and say, that could be something someday. But nobody really knew what they were or cared. And when I say nobody, I mean the general populace. Clearly, at IBM, they cared a great deal. And one of the things that they did is they did some really big stuff with missile defense and so forth. And when you done well, made IBM a lot of money, you became a fellow and you could pursue your own passion. And one of their passions was school, instruction, computers in the schools. Does that sound familiar? Yes, what goes around comes around. So, since the beginning of time, there have been smart people who wanted to reach out to and approach education as an important place to bring computing. And I was hanging around in high school, and so one of these they built a long distance line to my school from Armonk, New York, and threw some terminals on the end of it, and they were doing APL. Because believe it or not, APL, which stands for A Programming Language, which is one of the original functional-ish programming languages out there.
What goes around? You said
yes,
before,
exactly. Right? It was a brilliant language. It was also tiny. It was interpreted, which at the time things were just compiled, but this was interpreted. And it was one of the very first languages to run on the IBM 360, which is a mainframe if you haven't heard of it. And it was tiny, 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 tiny. And it, it ran for the time fast, and we had 16K of memory to play with, which was, what would we do with all of that? So
I know, right?
Yeah. So I wrote a poker program. I didn't play poker, but, it was some way to interact with a computer. Thought nothing of it. Anyway, get out of high school, time for a job. What the heck is a kid going to do? Has no money and can't quite get to college. He plays up the IBM card, and he gets in at Cornell University Medical School as a programmer in New York City, where I was taken under the wing of a wonderful mentor who was a neuroanatomist, which means he taught the pathways in the brain and so forth, and researcher. And he was fascinated by computer-assisted instruction. What goes around comes around. So my early work with functional languages was in natural language processing and computer-aided instruction. Wow, what a great way for a long-haired, smelly, hippie-looking kid to get a start in the game. And that's where it all began.
That's awesome.
Didn't have any real intention to do anything. And by the way, I learned something very fascinating in an article the other day. There was a time when there were more women, a lot more women in our field. And this was that time. And part of that was because there weren't personal computers around. Nobody was playing games. Nobody had come out of CS schools. Nobody had an advantage. And in the darker history of computing, women had been, the word for a computer was actually a human being who computed. And a lot of those women in the early days, a lot of those computers, people who calculated, were women. And so there was no male advantage, and it wasn't perceived of as a male field. And those two things meant that, you didn't have to have a degree. You just showed up. I was a kid, showed up out of high school, taxi driver, pole dancer, PhD in Slavic languages. These were my colleagues at Cornell, and they were women and they're men, and they just showed up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a good example of this is the movie Hidden Figures.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen that, but yeah.
Oh gosh, yes. Although, she confronted some very real resistance. But now I'm talking about entering in the 70s, and it was just the beginnings of a women's movement. So we were a little bit more aware of what was going on. And oh my God. I mean, I'm still embarrassed by the person that had my name back then when I was that young.
I think if you're not a little bit at least embarrassed by the person who had your name back then, you're not growing. So,
yeah. But we were like, we came out of everywhere, and we were valued for what we could do.
Yep.
And there was no advantage to having spent, as emerged in the 80s, of having wasted your youth playing video games, which were primarily boy things, and then walking into, a computer science school saying, I already know about computers, and basically turning it into a bro culture that alienated women. So I'm not saying that's the only reason, but I'm saying it was a compelling reason. And it was just a different time.
Right. So I'm sure you had a little bit of your career before you got into JavaScript.
Yes, we have not gotten to JavaScript. Let's hustle. Okay, so I needed money to go to college and then eventually grad school,
right? Which
was going to be in sociology, by the way. No CS. Never took a CS course. Sat in on one once, but no. So it turned out if you knew anything about computers, you could get a job as a consultant. And so summers I would work in the financial district in New York, writing APL on mainframes.
Nice.
Writing financial programs, and APL became a popular language with investment banking firms back in the day, and to this day it's still used there. So I was a consultant forever because I was trying to get through graduate school and not be into this game. And then somewhere I realized that I was really doing more computing than I was going to grad school. And I had a revelation that maybe grad school was not for me, not in sociology. Oh, but my thesis would have been so great because there was in Berkeley, in the early 80s, I was studying the way in which programmers are organized and the kind of work that they do and how it contrasts with other, then popular themes about what automation does to workers' behavior. And so I hooked up with this group in Berkeley, California, called Community Memory. You can look them up.
Mm-hmm.
They had this wacky idea that computers should be in public places and just let people wander up to them and start sharing information and having conversations with each other on it, like that was ever going to happen.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I wish we had something like that now.
I wish we had something like that now. Such a brilliant idea. It was the internet existed as the DARPANet at the time, but it was not yet the internet or the web. And they built their own boxes and put them in laundromats and coffee shops and things like that. And people would converse with each other, and then we would get the printouts of their conversation, because just like Facebook, hey, their information was our information. We could see what they all talked about and try and figure out whether this was a sort of a lefty-leaning group, whether we were transforming the social fabric in some positive way, which we weren't. Mostly the conversations were every bit as banal as we know them today. So anyway, that disappeared beneath the waves. And then I went to work for GE, because you got to go from a left-wing organization to GE. That's just a natural transition. And I did a lot of programming for them for a number of years as a consultant until they invited me to cross the barrier and become, and this was the best move I ever made. So listen to this, folks. I've been writing code all this time and taking orders sort of indirectly from the business. And they invited me, they had a big problem on the business, and they invited me to cross that boundary and go over there and be on the business side and start telling the IT department what it was that we wanted. And the guy who figured out that I would be a good candidate for that knew that he had been buffaloed by the IT department for so long. The only way he was going to dig out of the hole he was in was to get somebody who didn't fall for the excuses, could just make the change happen. But for me, what it was, and here's my recommendation to everybody, it was a chance to understand how that it wasn't all about technology decisions. It was about business decisions. What do we need to accomplish? Are we accomplishing anything here? And to value what the business people managed to somehow scrap together through Excel or whatever else they had on their own without the help of the IT department, because at least they were solving problems. Whereas we were luxuriating over there in the IT department, kicking around code as long as we wanted to, the way we thought it ought to be, and not actually meeting any needs at all. And to be on the other side of that, to cross that fence and to walk in those shoes, mixing metaphors, that is one of the best things you can do in your career. One of the best things I ever did, because it was at that moment that I learned two things. That what people wanted was important. I know it seems strange. And I also, at that moment, something happened, because I really wasn't paying attention to computing at that point as a practice, as a discipline, as something that had discipline. And suddenly I became also interested in how programs actually work and how we build them. And now I became interested in the kind of academic stuff that would have not interested me at all in the previous years, that I would have sort of floated through in CS, but never really understood. So that was big moments. From there,
it's interesting. I just want to chime in real quick. I hear some people say that, every developer should go freelance for a year for some of those same reasons, right?
Wow.
Where you have to go run your own business and, fight some of these things. And if you're not adding value, they want you gone, especially smaller business.
Exactly. And the other great thing about consulting is you get fired a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I got fired a lot, not because I was bad, as far as I know, but because, hey, it's a consultant. The gig lasts so long, and then it's time. On you go. And you change. You go from one business to another, from one project to another. And when you sign up for one company, I don't care if it's a startup or not, and you live there year after year after year, you have no idea what it's like and then the first time they let you go, you think it's a tragedy. I know I did. tears. Oh, God. I was like a baby.
Yeah.
But eventually it's kind of like, really? You're cutting me loose? Oh, this is going to be great. I get to do something different.
Yep.
And that's that's an important career move.
Yep.
It's important career moment.
Absolutely. So going back to your story, what happened after GE?
Well, that was a place that I got let go. They sent me to Germany to set up a leasing company, and I flew over there for 4 months. The minute I landed, they said, well, we're actually selling your company, and we don't want you to do that. So you're going to be out of a job, but you got to spend 4 months there just killing time, and you can't let anybody know that we're not
Oh, geez.
we're not going to do it. So I used the time productively in Germany, needless to say, and came back, and now it was time to get a job. By that time, I'd actually somehow managed to spend 7 years at GE. It started as a 3-month contract, and I was 7 years at GE. Some great years there, by the way. That was, I know people think, oh, how horrible could that have been? Couldn't have been a more formative experience.
Right.
An enterprise is not necessarily where you go to die. It's just what you do with it.
Yep.
So from there, it was now the 90s, and it's time for startups, right? That was the first wave of a startup. And of course, a buddy of mine invited me to join a startup that made absolutely no economic sense. I talked to him about it, and I said, this makes no sense. He said, I know, but the valuations are like crazy, and they'll give you all kinds of stock. And if you hit it just right, you're going to walk away, with big bucks. And so, I had a high stock deal, and they gave me an apartment in Santa Clara, and I'm doing all this stuff. Of course, it blew up with no value. Yeah, So I just missed it by this much. So that was out. Then then there was some kind of economic crisis. I can't remember what it was. I guess it was just the web blowing up.
The dot-com bubble.
Yeah, all those dot-coms cratered. And so naturally we started another one.
Of course.
Because what else are you going to do? And it was when .NET was just an alpha.
Mm-hmm.
And we were really interested in client-side computing. Never believed that you should build a client application on the web because, going back to the server all the time for anything was so stupid. You couldn't deliver a decent user experience. And that was absolutely true then. Mm-hmm. There were some JavaScript attempts at the time, and they all were fragile, and they were slow, and they were awful. And with .NET, you could build a client-side application and distribute it over the web. Not easily, but you could do it. The target computer had to have .NET on it, but you could do it. And so we were really excited. And we built things in WinForms in those days, and that we built a framework, an ORM for client-side. And that was the founding of IdeaBlade, my current company. Then Silverlight came along, and we said, wow, this is so much better than because you didn't have to rely on .NET on the client.
Right.
And Silverlight, I got to tell you, was really brilliant. I mean, the mistake was that it said, we're not going to use HTML as the templating language. We're going to have our own. That was probably an error, but still, it was wonderful to be able to deliver a client-side experience over the web without any deployment hassle other than going to you went to the link. And 5 meg, hey, who cares, right? The client size. That was small. That was the hello world was 5 meg. But then there was this thing called the iPhone. Never if you heard of it.
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah. Well, I didn't because I had a Palm Pilot and then I had a Windows Phone. But Apple decided that it didn't like Flash. And so it wasn't going to let Flash load in the browser. And that pretty much meant that Silverlight wasn't going to run in the browser either.
Right.
And it was game over for Silverlight, just like that. You snap your fingers and your technology is gone.
Well, Steve Jobs snapped his fingers, but yeah.
Right. Well, no, but Microsoft had to recognize the reality.
No, absolutely.
And, they did in surprisingly quick fashion. Partly that was because Silverlight was not, there were forces at work in the Windows group, which was very strong at the time, that hated it. There were forces at work in the ASP.NET world that hated it. So there were political forces, but really it was the reality that the dream of being on every browser and every venue was gone.
Right. And I've talked to a number of people that made the transition to JavaScript at that point.
Yep, John and I were together. John Papa and I, we were there for that moment. He was a Silverlight evangelist. Well, I don't know what they called him, but he was evangelizing Silverlight at that time. And so then there was this thing, like somebody told me there was JavaScript, and I said, "Are you kidding? I programmed with that in the '90s. I don't ever want to see it again." And then he said, "Well, don't worry, it's not on the client; it's on the server." And I said, "Now you really got to be kidding." This thing Node. I said, "You're just out of your freaking mind." He says, "Yeah, go try it." So I goofed around with it. I could see that the V8 engine was changing the calculation.
Right.
And now with Silverlight dead, we began to think, oh God, and there was the guy who was leading Silverlight. I remember this so clearly. We're on a tram together and we had this product and that worked for Silverlight. And he said, you guys really ought to look at JavaScript. I said, come on, but this was a really sharp guy and an experienced guy. He says, you really ought to look at JavaScript. I said, are you kidding me? That's just awful. He said, no, take a look again. All right. So
I went through the same thing, but
did you?
Well, I didn't transition from Flash to JavaScript. I was much more back-end focused with Ruby on Rails.
So Ruby is kind of this, yeah? Is it Ruby is this happening in the Ruby world about this time also?
To a certain degree. I mean, people still build server-rendered applications, but, the front-end frameworks really started to make people think about this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, even just having it nicely organized by Backbone was a big deal.
Well, we just had jQuery in the beginning,
yeah.
Right? But jQuery was a revelation because you finally were able to get over the browser, the different browsers, which just destroyed any productivity.
Yep.
jQuery got us out of that, and that was such a brilliant piece of work. I mean, we make fun of it now, but you can't. You got to realize what a stroke of genius that was.
Yep.
And that opened things up, and that made things like Backbone possible.
Yep.
So I did some Backbone, Knockout for a while. We really thought Knockout was going to win. I have this habit of picking.
A lot of people thought Knockout was going to win.
Well, and there were some good reasons.
Yeah.
Knockout was really good, and the documentation was really good, and it was written by a guy who has this simpatico intelligence and communication skills named Steve Sanderson. If you don't know who he is, but you do know, it's killing me. The guy from React. Dan Abramoff.
Uh-huh.
If you've ever seen Dan Abramoff speak and you've read what he writes and you see how he approaches the world, you just want to be part of whatever Dan is doing. And Steve was that way. And Knockout was that way. It was just, it understood how important it was to communicate to developers, that this was a happy home. And so we took on Knockout. But, AngularJS is coming.
Funny enough, on JavaScript Jabber very early on. So that's the time frame where we were starting JavaScript Jabber.
Yeah. And it was good. And then Steve, oh gosh, what's his name? It's got Rob Eisenberg hooked it together with some other things that we borrowed from the .NET world. And came up with something called Durandal. So now you didn't just have a framework for, because Knockout was very exclusively focused on how do I interact between JavaScript objects and the screen and through templating and binding.
Right.
But you need a lot more. And so Rob came up with something called Durandal. And so we started writing Durandal apps commercially, and where the world was good. But with Knockout, you essentially had, in order to make it really work properly, you had to transform the objects into getters and setters that raised events in order for the binding system to work. There was no way back in those days to automate that very easily. I mean, we had our own way. So there's this thing called Angular. And I watched somebody do a presentation and I laughed it off. And I looked at it and I said, this can't possibly work. Again, once again, showing my capacity for picking technology. Cannot possibly work because it's executing, it's looking at every change, every cycle of the JavaScript engine. There is no way it can examine every property quick enough in a real application.
This episode is brought to you by Triplebyte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume, you spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, Triplebyte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. Triplebyte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/astory. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through Triplebyte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
So there's no way it can do it. No way it can get around the horn there, fast enough, particularly since it didn't go around once. It would look at all the bindings, all right? And then maybe you did something in response to some change that was the user made, and you might change the model, and that should update the screen. So it went back around again, and if you did, that meant the model wasn't stable, and so it updated the screen and went around one more time, and it would keep going around until the model stabilized, or you would go around 10 times, in which case it threw up. And I said, this can't work. There is no way this can work, except that when I looked at it, it could work. And what it meant was so liberating. It meant that I could hook the template. I could bind a template to any kind of object, not just a special knockout object, but any object. And it made one instantly more productive. And it had two-way data binding. I don't know how that became a bad word because to me, two-way data binding remains an important, the idea that with a single piece of syntax, you can simultaneously specify how the value gets from the class into the template, and the user action that updates that property flows back into the model. That's that just with a single piece of syntax. We called that two-way data binding, and Angular, the Angular we know today, has that, even though they would resist calling it two-way data binding because two-way data binding is a dirty word. But it's it's enormously productive. Well, Angular had it, and almost overnight, everything switched for us to Angular, what we now know as AngularJS, and the world was good. But finally, HTML and JavaScript.
But before we get too far down the road, what was the demo you saw? Do you remember?
I don't. I just remember writing my own, to see if I'd really understood it correctly. If it really was doing that. I mean, I went hunting for events and couldn't find them. Mm-hmm. So I don't remember seeing a demo so much as writing one.
Okay.
Was there a
I don't know. I don't remember there being like a groundbreaking. Yeah. I ran into Angular through Joe and Aaron. So
no, I just stumbled into it. And I think I actually talked John into taking a look at it. It's usually the other way around. John usually tells me to take a look at something that I don't believe in. Right. But it was a colleague of mine who thought Angular was going to be a winner, and I said, no, you're wrong. It's going to be knockout. But I once again, I had made, you want investment advice, just do the opposite of whatever I tell you.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, and I agree with you on the two-way data binding. I mean, it really broke through a lot of productivity things for me too.
You could just drop a script. You dropped a script tag on your code. It felt like this. You dropped a script tag on your code, and you were hooking up, and you were going. It was, and it had DI, which I love. I'm coming from .NET, so DI makes a lot of sense. Dependency injection made a lot of sense to me, and it was still JavaScript and all that stuff, but it was a great step forward. We could build real things with it. And then HTML, the 5 finally is out there, and people and the Angular team is ready to take another crack at it and come up with a framework, brand new framework, which totally different, which they decided to call, just, I don't know, they had to come up with a name of some kind, and they decided to call it Angular. Remember? It was like, oh no. So and then they had that wonderful October 31st unveiling, Halloween unveiling, in which they did RIP Angular, and that
man,
that was a disaster.
Yeah, it was
a marketing disaster. But it was still the right move. But it's hubris again. You think everybody loves you all the time. You don't everybody doesn't realize how ready developers are to say, well, you screwed me, I'm going someplace else. I'm taking my business somewhere else. You've got to be kind to the developer. And it's a lesson that I think companies never tire of learning the hard way. So anyway, Angular, I was in early on the Angular, the move to Angular. And, I could see what was going to be possible. I didn't realize just how important TypeScript would be. I played with it up to that point, and it was, it looked promising right from the beginning, but in its early days, it was painful to use. But it turned a corner. Angular team smartly set aside its vision of writing its own language and adopted TypeScript, which was very wise. And there you have it. So Angular was taking off, and I was kind of involved early. And in the early days, we were complaining a lot about lack of documentation. I think every framework suffers from this.
Yes, that's true.
And I can remember after some sort of show, some conference or something like that, they kept some of the loudmouths around and said, what do you think of this Angular thing? And so naturally I went off, being a certified loudmouth. I went off on the lack of documentation and how important it was to adoption. And Brad Green, who runs the Angular, it's the sort of product, I don't know what his official title is, but it's his. Overall, from a business perspective, which isn't to say he doesn't know technically, he knows technically perfectly well everything that's going on in there. So anyway, Brad says, well, if I paid you, would you do something about it? I said, I sure would. And so I
always wondered how you wound up with that gig.
It was a dare, he dared me. And I said, yeah. Now I think they actually needed, they clearly had a need. They recognized the need.
Right.
But he looks in this circle here and says, would you do something about it? I said, I sure would. And so we got together, my little company, IdeaBlade, and Brad and Igor and some folks, and we hammered out what the characteristics of a documentation framework for Angular would look like and where the content would come from. Because we were charged both with building the underlying framework, which we did in Angular,
right?
The first going, not the new Angular, sorry, in AngularJS, and which later became an embarrassment. But what I did was I got to go out with the help of Naomi. I can't remember her last name, but she was good. And we hunted down people who said who wrote interesting things about Angular and AngularJS, and asked if they would be willing to contribute. We'd pay them. Not a lot, but we'd pay them to write content. And so we started writing Angular documentation. And for the next year and a half or two, I was privileged to be the ringmaster of the Angular documentation effort. And it brought me, taught me so much. Working with people from around the world who were interesting in their own right, and working with the Angular team, and it was a great experience. And we did good stuff. I think we did good work.
Yeah, it's, in my opinion anyway, it's some of the best documentation out there, and I think it speaks as much to your kind of the vision that you had, as well as just having a cohesive effort around it. I think a lot of communities really lack that. And so the documentation just kind of gets generated out of code comments and things like that. And you have this smattering of blog posts, and there's not really a clear, hey, this is how we do this. And, I've seen it kind of get mimicked a little bit by like Vue. So they have a pretty cohesive documentation team now. I haven't seen that as much with React.
No.
But yeah, it really just speaks to, okay, we had, one person in there kind of driving the train or driving the truck and, getting us where we needed to go. And, so you helped everybody else get where they needed to go to get the documentation done. But it all came out of one, central idea around how it was supposed to look.
Well, and there are two things I'd like to tack onto that. First, I have to tip my hat to the Angular team, and to Brad in particular, because they were willing to make an investment. They were willing to put dollars on the line.
Yep.
Treat it like a real project. Treat the documentation as a product feature from the beginning. And
right.
You put your money where your mouth is, and they put their money where their mouth was. And then they gave time. Igor, Trust, and Pete and George, Pete Baker Darwin and George. I'll get the names later, and because you get to the point where you're on a first, you just think first names, and and the Alexes and I could just go on and on. I mean, what's the matter with me? Because I'm afraid, it's like at the Academy Awards, I'm afraid to leave somebody out. There were so Victor and all these other names that are at the tip of my tongue, and I'm embarrassed to leave them out. So I'm not even going to name any more names, but you know who you are, and you know how important you were, giving of your time, and then Google giving of their money. And so I think that you can't beat that. You can't beat that. And then the second thing I wanted to point out was that we always understood that our Angular documentation was the seed for blog posts. We weren't going to try and teach everything, but we were going to help get the people who like to teach. We were going to get them far enough down the road so that they could then make their own discoveries and speak about Angular in their own voices. And that's why, to this day, there is so much great material about Angular written by other people who had a completely different take on it than we did as authors of the documentation.
Awesome. So what are you working on now, Ward?
Well, let's see. I got into the NGRX thing on a dare.
Yeah.
All right. And so John and I dreamed up because the NGRX, it has both a grip on the developer community mind, and it has really good things about it. And what there was, the big problem is that you have to write, as a consumer of it, you have to write so much. And John and I thought we could at least address that. The sheer amount of code that you as a developer have to write in order to work with NGRX to manage state on the client. And so John and I developed this little framework, a little library that plugs into NGRX, and we call it NGRX data, and it's supposed to become part of NGRX any day now. So we did that, and now I'm using it at a client, and I've been working for the last year and a half with a client building an Angular app that uses it's a form over data app, kind of line of business, although it's the consumers are use it. And but it's got reactive style in it, and it uses NGRX and NGRX data, uses them both. And we've been working on it hammer and tongs for the last year and a half, and I finally feel like I've got a grip on how you write things with RxJS and how you write things with NGRX. So it's time to start sharing some of the patterns that have emerged with the rest of the world, and I hope to do that.
Nice. Very cool. And yeah, I think we've talked a little bit about NGRX data on Adventures in Angular, and it'll be interesting to see where things go from here.
Yeah, guess what's missing? Documentation.
Hey, I know a guy.
Yeah, you know a guy? Yeah. The thing with open source is you got to figure out where the energy comes from and where the money comes from. And my hat's off to the NGRX guys, Mike Ryan and Brandon Roberts. I recruited Brandon Roberts for the documentation. I'm very proud to say. You get really proud when I didn't actually do anything. He does all the stuff, but you feel really proud when you identified somebody and you found them. Anyway, they've done a wonderful job of, because they get nothing for it, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's paying them to write documentation, and they've done it. All documentation could be better, but they've got some. And that's spawned this whole sub-community of people who are teaching people how to use NGRX. So I want to do the same, see if I can't spark that with NGRX data.
Yep. Sounds good. All right. Well, anything else you want to bring up before we go to picks?
Well, I've just been yakking away, taking people on a journey that I don't know. What do I want to say? No, I think that's it. Let's figure out what we want to pick here.
All right. Well, I'll let you go first. Do you have some picks for us?
I think I want to pick a person who I saw speak a couple of weeks back who's still on my mind. Her name is Lisa Genova, a scientist, and she wrote a novel called Still Alice, which is about Alzheimer's. It's what, she had all of the facts and figures about Alzheimer's, and it's amazing. She has a TED Talk, and it's what you would expect. Somebody says, what's the question that's on everybody's mind? How do I not get Alzheimer's? All right. And of course that's important, right? Because we'd all really rather not get it. But her talk wasn't about that. And Still Alice isn't about that. It's not, because there's really, like, if you live at 85, 50% of people are going to get it. And if you're not in the 50% that get it, you're in the 50% of people who have to care for somebody who's got it.
Yep.
And so it isn't, it's great. Like, how do I keep myself from getting it? But her focus in this talk, and it's part of what Still Alice is about in the movie Still Alice, is about how do you relate to somebody who has it. And one of the, among the many, many, many takeaways, just brilliant, touching moments in there. The thing that's true about the disease is that you lose your cognitive memory, but you don't lose your emotional self. And it's right there, you look at the diseased brain, and it's a horrible, horrible picture. They show side by side a healthy brain and not. And you just see the pit, the masses of neurons that are gone. But apparently what remains is your emotion. And so what you say, what she teaches is how to be empathetic, and how in talking to somebody who has Alzheimer's, they may not remember what you say, but they remember how you feel, how you made them feel. For hours later, they won't know why they feel that way, but they'll remember, but they'll feel it. And they're still living an emotional life. And one of the just chilling examples is, she says, let me tell you two kinds of conversation that can happen. One is you you talk to your grandmother or whomever, and she says, so I'm waiting for my mother. I'm sitting here at the bus stop waiting for my mother to come. And you can tell her that her mother died 30 years ago. And she will experience that as if I told you, Chuck, that your mother died right now, today. It's not just that it's not true. You will experience the pain of loss, the suddenness of loss, as if it happened today. Or you could say, what a lovely day to be here on the bench. I'll wait here with you. What do you think of X? You don't have to confront the facts. You confront the situation. You have a conversation about the situation, and you turn it into a lovely moment. And I thought that was so powerful. And there's many things that she said were so powerful. So I want people to go and look up Lisa Genova, look up Still Alice. And that was a long pick. Sorry, man, you got me in this reflective moment.
No, it's fine. And it's interesting because my grandparents, my mother's parents, both suffered from pretty severe dementia. And I don't know what defines Alzheimer's versus dementia, but yeah, I mean, that was my grandmother. And when my grandfather passed away, she couldn't figure out where he was.
That's right.
And, I think the first couple of times one of my aunts or, somebody would, tell her that he had passed, and then she would go through that.
It was horrifying. She relives it over and over again, as fresh as the day it happened.
Yep. And yeah, I think eventually we just got to the point where it was like, well, let's just sit here and wait for him.
Yeah.
Or, or just talk to her about something else.
Yeah.
And
there were gems like this threaded throughout. And I just think there are life lessons here. And she touched everybody in that audience.
Yep. I'll have to go check it out. Boy, I don't know if I have anything that I think we should just end it there.
Okay.
But thanks for coming, Ward.
Thanks for having me.
If people want to follow you on Twitter or find you online somewhere.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. I am Ward Bell on Twitter, WARDBELL. And I'm on Twitter, off and on. Like everybody, I can't help but look for myself. Although I used to be, hang on Twitter every 5 minutes, and now I've learned to moderate my Twitter use. You can find me on our show together, Adventures in Angular. And also I have a new podcast, relatively new. I guess we're up in our 20s now, with John Papa, called Real-Time JavaScript.
Yep.
And I'd love to see you all there.
Yeah, go check them out. All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap up right here. Thanks for coming, Ward.
Great to be here. Thanks, Chuck.
All right. We will catch everybody next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.